to the Higher Education Access Corner. I'm your host, Tiffanie DeVan, and today I have with me Bonnie Lee Behm. She is a trusted resource in financial aid and has been around since 1978 in the higher education industry. She was directly involved in financial aid since 1981. She was previously the director of financial aid at Thomas Jefferson University. She went on to Swarthmore College and was the associate director of aid there. She's gone on to Villanova University in 1999. She was the director of financial aid there. And then in 2020, she actually moved to the director of strategic initiatives for enrollment management with an emphasis on financial aid planning. So for those of you who are listening to us today or even viewing us on the videos, you can know and be rest assured that we have a very trusted resource to talk about FAFSA and financial aid, specifically FAFSA simplification and the changes that are coming. So welcome, Bonnie, to the Higher Education Access Corner.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Tiffany.
Absolutely. So for those of our listeners who are not familiar with FAFSA, let me first start out by saying FAFSA stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid. It is the largest application for financial aid that students generally are going to complete. It's the primary application that is used to help students see if they qualify for financial aid from federal government, state government, schools, as well as some scholarship organizations as well. For those who aren't aware, FAFSA is actually going to be undertaking one of the largest major redesign in about maybe 3 or 4 decades to come. So it's going to look a lot different. And we've been talking about FAFSA simplification changes now for quite some time. I'm happy to have Bonnie here because she's going to break down a lot of the different changes, what we can expect, and we'll talk about some resources as well with this whole process. So Bonnie, just to get started with everything with FAFSA simplification, if you can, let me know about some of the things that we've heard of thus far about the simplification process and some of the changes that we can actually expect.
Well, as you said, it's a major change. Since I've been in financial aid since '81, this is probably one of the largest changes that we've seen. And it's not only just a redesign of the application or a simplification of the application to allow families to go through it more quickly. It's also a kind of a research or kind of a change to the formula that the information that the families provide to the schools, how their eligibility will change. And a lot of it is very, very good news, especially for our lower income families. There's going to be a lot more eligibility for students and families in that with lower incomes. And there's also there's reductions in the questions. There's a reformatting of the application. There's additional things that are going to be pluses to families. The FAFSA is going to allow families or students to add up to 20 schools, because when the student completes the application, it needs to go to a school for the school to make the determination of their eligibility for aid based on the information they provide as a result of the formula. But they can now go to 20 schools versus 10. And the other good thing is that there's going to be availability. The FAFSA will be available in 11 languages. And so that's going to allow a lot of additional access. There's a whole lot more formulaic changes, and I think we probably want to go through some of them, not all of them. But just so families understand, this hasn't just happened. It's going to happen mostly. The big changes are going to happen July 1, 2024, although you're going to be starting to fill out that FAFSA earlier. But this has been happening little by little. There's been small steps that have happened since about 2022, most of which have been probably, have not even come to the surface for the families. It just might be a question or two that has been eliminated or not considered anymore. But the biggest change to the FAFSA and what families will see will occur when they're completing the 2024 application, which typically, and here's another big change, typically, like it's the last 6 or 7 years, they've been completing it starting October 1. It's not going to be available October 1 this year for the 24-25 cycle. It's going to open sometime in December. And I don't know, and Tiffanie, I don't think you heard yet exactly the date. So
Not yet.
stay tuned. We are all kind of learning as we're going through this. It won't be available till sometime in December. So families kind of need to regroup if they've been used to filling it out earlier in the fall. Hold tight. Going to be open in December, but it's going to be a one-time change only. So as we're going through this transition, the Department of Ed realizes how monumental it is, and they just weren't able to get everything in line for the October start date. But they promise us that they will have it in line by the December, some December whatever date, so that families will be able to start completing the 24-25 FAFSA sometime in December for the 24-25 academic year.
All right. So just to make sure that everybody is aware, because you kind of gave us a lot, which is great. For that student who plans to be enrolled in a post-secondary school between July 1st, 2024 through June 30th, 2025, the FAFSA application that they will complete is a 24-25 application. And also in addition to that, like you said, they won't complete that until as early as December 2023. For that student who is in high school, that would be their senior year. So you have to be at least a senior or a student. If you're an adult, you have to be that student who's planning to be enrolled for the 24-25 academic school year. And like you mentioned, there are some changes that are out there, and these changes are pretty much affecting everyone. So if you could, what type of changes can like your universities or your schools expect from their standpoint? And we don't have to go in too much detail, but we do have some listeners who are on the post-secondary level.
The big changes for the school are, well, first of all, there's going to be some mandated changes to definitions for students applying that we will see and that we'll be able to we'll have to work with. And then there's also changes to questions on the FAFSA, things that we normally would have had in the past. Some of those are going to be removed from the FAFSA form. So schools might no longer have data that they used before, as well as some information that the parents have given us in regards to income. So let me kind of break that down a little bit more. The big change is how aid will be determined, eligibility for aid, I should say. In the past, when you submit your data, the information that was given to the school, something called an expected family contribution. That word is going to change, or those terms are going to change, and it's now going to be something called a student aid index. So that's a big change for the school. And even though it's just like, it sounds like just a word change, behind that word change is a whole definition of eligibility. Much more is going to be focused on data that's right off the tax return. So the family who is used to completing most of the FAFSA by pulling up a tax return and filling out things on paper, a lot more of the information this year is supposed to be garnered directly from the tax return. Now, we've had the opportunity to do that before, but it was somewhat optional. It's going to almost be mandated that that any family that has filed a tax return has to go in and have their data automatically put onto the FAFSA form. There are some exceptions because not everybody can do that. But for the school, that's a big change, or I should say for maybe counselors or faith-based organizations or campus-based organizations that help families fill out forms, as well as schools, because there's a lot of schools that will have financial aid nights. They're probably not going to be able to do those financial aid nights the same, because the families are going to have to bring that data in automatically from the IRS, where in the past, they could give us a tax return and we can help them. We never filled them out for them, but we could help them. And now it's going to be more of the family's going to have to be there a little more involved. Also, some of the data elements. some things on the untaxed income side that families used to submit, because it's not coming directly off of the tax return, some of those questions have been eliminated. So from the school side, we're so used to, especially somebody like myself who's been in this business so long, we're so used to just ticking off all these other things that, have been standard in evaluation for years and years. And that's going to change. So we're going to have to need to kind of retrain ourselves, let alone families. There's going to be definite changes to the definitions who custodial parents are for students who have parents that are divorced or separated. And then changes to, or I should say, increased eligibility to students who are considered independent. A lot more emphasis and a lot more expansion to students who have who are at risk of being homeless or who don't have, a permanent situation. So, there's some not programmatic definition changes. There's some data element changes, and then there's changes as to who is going to be filling out the form or not in the case of a student who has some, has a homeless situation or who has been in some sort of transitional housing. So there's real significant changes that the school's going to have to think about before we just rattle off what we used to. We're going to be getting the data the same. We're going to be doing our awards the same from the school's perspective, but with different data and with different definitions to things that we used to have and that have been standards for years and years and years.
So if can we spend a little time talking about like the parents, because that is going to be a little different. So changes to who's considered the custodial parent. So like maybe if we focus on like which parent, and this is speaking for a dependent student, for a dependent student, they must provide parental information. For the 24-25 FAFSA, like you mentioned, that's going to look different with who's going to be providing their information on there as the parent for the student. Currently, right now, if you could explain currently what it's like, who has to provide their information, and then what it's going to look like in the future of 24-25.
I'll try the best I can.
Okay.
I don't have all of the things set, and I'm not sure if we've got if there's going to be any clarifications later. But right now for 23-24, if a student has a situation where the parents are divorced or separated, the parent who the student lives with for more than 6 months of the year, or lives with the most, I should say, is the parent who is responsible for putting in the information. In the future, in 24-25, we're advised that it is not the parent for whom the student lives with, it's the student who provides more financial support. Now, I know that question is going to be, directed to the financial aid office or to FIA or anybody else. Well, who is that? And unfortunately, we can't answer that question. And in kind of, the conversations in the financial aid community is that could also change from year to year. I mean, usually the student that lives with the same parent for a certain period of time, and that usually doesn't change throughout their time in college. But now that it's going to be based on the parent who provides more financial support, that can change more frequently. So, so what you're doing for 24-25, if for some reason, maybe there's a divorce decree, or maybe one parent has a job and the other parent doesn't anymore, you might switch from year to year as you go through your college career from putting one parent into one custodial parent onto the next one. Now that's not changing for when there is a situation where there is, either, where there is a married couple or whether it's a single parent and that's the only parent involved. But when there is a divorce or separation, that's changing, and that's a significant change. It doesn't sound like that, but if you read, it's very nuanced in the definition. So you've got to read it and see that it's the parent who provides more financial support. So that's the big change for us.
Right. For that person who's never ever had to complete a FAFSA application. So for a family who's never done an older FAFSA before, this is not going to feel as different. For that person who is a returning student, so they're going to be doing a renewal FAFSA, or someone who's done one in the past. Those are the, I think, individuals or families that may notice a difference, or we want to really reiterate that custodial parent is different for the upcoming 24-25 academic school year.
If this is their first time, senior in high school now, filling it out, or, even an older, maybe an adult going to college for the first time, they're not going to be as aware of the changes because it is what it is. It's, they're just going to go through this and know that this is one of the things that they need to do to gain access to higher ed. But for the family who maybe have only done it once or have done it, for multiple children over the years, it's a dramatic change, or they might notice, or, they might be going through and then all of a sudden go, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. This is the year where they really need to pay attention to the questions and to read them and not just kind of complete them as they have in the past.
Agreed. And another thing that I think it's good to point out is when it comes to providing information for the FAFSA, you actually have to have all key players whose information is required on there complete their federal student aid ID account. So in the instance where it was the dependent student, the parent, and let's say custodial parent has remarried, so now it's the step parent's information on there, they're all going to have an FSA ID in order to get that FAFSA completed. Whereas in the past, you just needed the student and then one parent needed to provide an FSA ID. So I know that's also going to be a key factor that's a little bit different. And we can talk more about that as time goes on. So we don't have to go into all the specifics. Just want to give everyone an overview so that they're aware that FAFSA simplification is changing the way we were originally doing things in the past. So be prepared to create an FSA ID for yourself as a student, and then all key players whose information will be required, and they must consent to having, I believe it's the tax return, their tax information used or shared. And you can correct me if I'm wrong on that part, but I recall that being like one of the major key pieces as well.
Yes, that's another big definition, because I said before you could always, the past few years you've been able to pull down data from the IRS, but that was an option. If the family didn't want to, they didn't have to. Well, now if they filed, they're somewhat obligated, and they've got to provide consent. It's once a year consent. We just got that cleared. That was some question. But they've got to consent because obviously you're going into another system.
Right.
And that could cause some concern. Now for families who are not going to be filed or have not filed a tax return, and there are some families that don't need to, they can fill out the FAFSA, as they had in the past with their data. Right. But if you filed a tax return, and if you're basically going to have to provide that information, or have that information pulled in from the Department of Education, from the IRS, not the department, from the IRS. Now, the good news to this is maybe down the road, I know families don't like, some schools ask for tax returns to verify that the information they provided in the past was correct. I think this is kind of where the Department of Ed is going, is that they might not have as much verification. So you might not have to provide your tax returns to the schools, because the schools are going to see that the data is coming directly from the IRS. I say that, but I also want to kind of put the caveat in, is that some schools will still ask for a copy of the tax return, because they may need it. They may use additional items or additional verification pieces that, like I said, there's some things that are going to be eliminated, and maybe for their own institutional aid, they're going to use a little bit different methodology. So you really do need to connect with the school to see if they're going to require a copy of the tax return. But some schools that have asked for tax returns in the past, with this new kind of flow that's going to come right from the IRS, they might reduce that burden on the family. And other schools might say, no, we only have limited institutional aid. We do additional, review. You'll still need to complete it. So my advice to families and counselors is make sure that you check with the school to see what they want. And there's another comment I might add there is, because some of the data elements are being taken away, some schools might ask for an additional application with a few extra data elements. So again, check with the school or schools that you're applying to make sure that, is it just the FAFSA that they require, or is it the FAFSA and then some tax return, or is it their FAFSA and an institutional application, or some schools choose to use what's known the College Scholarship Service profile form. And so again, you really need to check with the school as to what they ask for determination of their institutional aid.
And most schools will have that information available either on their financial aid page, on their websites, sometimes admission pages. Those are usually the most common places I see them at, but have you seen them anyplace else? Or generally, if they contact the school's financial aid office, they'll let them know if there are additional forms that need to be completed.
You were perfect in that response. Most schools do have it on their either admissions and or financial aid page, or link from admissions to financial aid. That's typically where they would have them. But again, and especially if you've had a few children going to the same school, one year they might require one thing. This might be the year that they might change, take that a little bit different. So, make sure that you're connecting with the school or schools that your child is interested in, not just that they're admitted to, because remember, you're going to fill out this application before, in many cases, before you're even admitted to the school. So, don't just wait until you have an offer of admission. You want to start this financial aid process earlier. So you want to check with them kind of way before you get the letter that says you're in.
Absolutely. Good point to make. Also, and as a reminder to those students, they don't have to have been accepted or even applied to the schools in order to complete the FAFSA application. But like you said, they're going to list the schools that there's just an interest in. And you've also mentioned they can now do up to 20 schools as opposed to the 10 that they used to be able to list on the FAFSA application as well. You also mentioned, and just wanted you to highlight just a little bit about the CSS profile. Are there going to be any changes with the dates and the timelines for when someone could complete the CSS profile? Is FAFSA simplification going to have an impact on that?
The profile is a totally separate form from the FAFSA, so I'm just going to get that out. And there is a fee for the profile, although 2 years ago they reduced the fee. In fact, removed the fee for a lot of our lower income families, so allowed more access. But it's an additional form, and it has a different methodology, so it's not tied into the federal time constraints or applications, etc. The profile will be available October 1, just as it has been before. So we could have a family potentially who is interested in a few different schools, some requiring just the FAFSA, some requiring the FAFSA and the profile. And the school might say, we want you to fill out the profile by October or by November. I mean, October 1 it opens, but by November, so that we can have a decision of our institutional aid sometime in November, December, especially if a student is looking at maybe early decision or early acceptance for admission. So profile is kind of staying the same, very, very similar to what it was. Even the methodology is staying the same at this point. So if they filled out a profile in the past, they should be seeing similar timeframes, similar questions. They're streamlining some things in terms of just making them easier, and they've got some neat things in terms of like kind of making things easier for the family, but has nothing to do with the outcome. So that process still can begin October 1, and most schools are going to keep with their profile deadlines. It's just the FAFSA deadlines that may change. Again, there's only about 300 schools across the country that require the FAFSA, the profile. Everybody requires the FAFSA.
Right.
So it's a very limited scope of students and schools that are requiring the profile. But if you are looking at a school that requires it, please make sure that you do it, because that's essential to how they're evaluating their institutional aid.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, I also want to point out, because we're talking different deadlines for things and when different forms and applications open up. I think it's critical this year, especially, that students and families really pay attention to deadline. When are these forms when's the application period process begin and when does it end? Because again, CSS profile, it becomes available October 1st. FAFSA this year is going to be available December of some date. We don't have that final date, like you said, but there could have also be additional applications or institutional aid and things like that. They may or may not change when they're going to open. And you always want to make sure a student is aware that just because the FAFSA opens in December, we don't know when schools will say, for those schools who have a priority filing deadline, we don't know what those deadlines are going to look like. Yeah, and I don't know for you all just at Villanova, if you've started to have conversations on, hey, do you have a preference now on what the time frame will look like for when your students are going to be responsible to make sure they have their FAFSA completed? Have you all started, or even schools in general, started to talk about that yet?
Schools are starting to talk about it. I mean, we use the profile for institutional aid, so we're going to go with our regular. I think for early decision, it's a November timeframe. And then as soon as we hear, if it's earlier December, maybe we'll go out a little bit earlier with the deadline. But, if it's later December, obviously we can't have a January 15th deadline. That doesn't give families enough of a time. So, so we have a kind of a little more insight as to what's happening. I think we'll publish something and maybe next to it put tentative or, may change. But since we use the profile for our institutional aid, the early decision candidates, they'll have that available and we can go out with awards from that. Tiffany, when we're talking about that, state deadlines, are state deadlines for applying for aid going to change as a result? I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but
no, you're fine, because I was going to talk about that as well. So for Pennsylvania, we are not changing our deadlines. Our deadlines are going to remain the same. And like you mentioned, prior to the FAFSA becoming available in October, it used to be available January 1st of every year, and our deadlines were May 1st and August 1st. So they've not changed when it switched up, and they're not going to change now for this 1 year. So everything stays the same for us. For other states, if we have any viewers listening in from other states, they would want to make sure that they're checking with their state institution just to be on the safe side.
Yeah, I know some states have an earlier deadline. I mean, we're very fortunate in Pennsylvania, but I think that there's some states that have different deadlines. And and while we're talking about even just the eligibility, many states use the formula that the federal government is using for determination of federal aid, but some states have their own. So again, there's a lot of confusion and change in this environment. So yeah, stay tuned, because I don't even know if everybody has their kind of all their ducks in a row in terms of what's going on. So it's evolving. And I think one of the things for families is to stay tuned to what's going on at listen to if the college that they're looking at or colleges that they're looking at send out emails. This is not the year to delete them, because they might have some really important information. Or if your high school might be, especially for those who are in high school, if your guidance counselors send out information about some training programs, because the Department of Education has a whole roadmap of training programs, both for the colleges, because we need to be trained, for counselors in the high school environment, and then for parents and students as well too.
Yep. So, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more so we can give them some resources before we wrap up on that. And I think that it's important that everyone knows that even though we're talking about all these changes, there is a plan to kind of make sure everyone stays informed, and so that they're ready to actually complete the FAFSA when it does take place. But if we can back up just a little bit, let's talk a little bit about the federal Pell Grant and how FAFSA simplification will impact that. What are some changes that you're aware of, if any, on how Pell is going to be calculated, or how the FAFSA simplification process will affect Pell in general?
Well, this is the one term when the word simplification doesn't necessarily mean simplified. Although in the past, when a family provided their data, what they received back when they completed the FAFSA was something called expected family contribution. And the school used that number not only to determine their eligibility for federal aid and maybe for institutional aid in some cases, but also we had a big chart that we looked up and said, here's your index, here's your eligibility for Pell. As a result of this whole FAFSA simplification process, there is the change to the term. It's the resulting number that comes out is what's going to be called the student aid index. And that's going to be the kind of the term that the school and the Department of Ed is using to say, this is your index to determine what you're eligible for. Pell used to be a combination of, and it still will be a combination of your income and asset data, but it's on our side, and I don't want to get into the weeds because it's really deep. On the school side, it's a lot more of who you are and where your income is, and there's a lot of things taken out of the formula. It's probably the easiest, and it's much more regulated to adjusted gross income and poverty levels as well too. So there will be a larger, and as a result, there's a larger population of people who will qualify for Pell because of the formulaic change than there was in the past. And again, without going on for hours and more of the weeds, Pell is going to be available to a much larger audience. They're projecting that possibly 20% more families will qualify for Pell, which is great because Pell is the aid that's offered to the lowest income families. So those that need it the most are gonna, from what we understand, are going to benefit the most. And there's been some models that schools have been given that we could put in our data, and we at Villanova did it, and we are seeing if the model was done correctly, that we're definitely going to be increasing the number of Pell eligible students. So that's really good news for families and students, where in the past they wouldn't qualify. This year they may qualify. But again, it's just really a matter of your adjusted gross income, and even kind of your tax filing status. If you filed or if you didn't file, it's much more of kind of like a chart. If yes, kind of like one of those tree charts where it's like, if yes, you go down this and you're eligible for Pell, or if not, you're not eligible. It's not this very lengthy grid where we have a number and we just pick out your Pell eligibility. Then that will all be transparent, or it's all transparent. You can find all this information, but the families aren't going to have to get into those, that deep into the woods. They're going to see if they're eligible or not without knowing all of the details behind it. But rest assured, from all that we've been told, is that there'll be a greater number of people eligible for Pell. That's the good news. As a result of some of this, there are some families who, and it's more of the upper income families, that might see a change or possibly a loss of some federal aid eligibility. So our lower income and our lower middle income families will probably see some great changes as a result, more eligibility for Pell. But our upper income families, because of some of the things that have been taken away, may see that their eligibility for either work study or supplemental grant, or maybe the direct loan, might be taken away. So, I caution not as much. The new student coming in wouldn't see the differences. Those students who are going from maybe a freshman in college to sophomore, junior, senior, they may see that they might be eligible for something this year, but not in the future. The big change to this, and the big thing is that multiple children in college is no longer considered in determining a family's eligibility. And so that factor alone, along with some other things, but that factor alone could change some eligibility. I don't want to scare families who are listening.
And that's actually one of the things some families are already aware of that, because we've been getting questions on that. And I think that may impact, like you said, that definitely can impact the student who's currently there and who's going to be returning next year.
I was just talking to a group of high school counselors, and they were concerned because, if there's a student in school, will I have to drop out? What's going to happen? I think, schools are really aware of this major change and are right now, I think, looking at what they're going to do for some of these populations where they went from, maybe X amount of eligibility to none, or Y eligibility, and what we can do within the federal limits, because we can't just say, oh, we don't like that change. There's some changes we love are going to go on, and there's some changes that have been prescribed that we can't just say, oh no, we don't want to do. We can always change things for our institutional aid eligibility, but not for federal. And so there's a lot of discussion and, schools getting together and saying, well, this population may lose aid. What can we do? Because we don't want to bring them in and then have them leave. I mean, that's not what schools want to do. We want to bring them in, we want to retain them, and we want to graduate them. And then,
Right.
and loss of eligibility for some families, they may not be eligible anymore. So if you are in a position where you're in college right now and you see these changes, talk to your school. There's also things called, there's an appeal process that a school can do, or professional judgment if there's some changes. And so this might be the year that you might need to, talk to your financial aid office and say, hey, what can you do? I'm in my senior year. I'm about to graduate. I've got one more, on my final stretch, but yet my eligibility has been changed. What can you do? I can't answer those questions. I mean, everybody's in that discussion, but I can't answer them for the other schools. They've got to contact their school to see what effect those changes might have. But for some of them, they're going to see, oh, wow, I'm going to get more Pell, or I might get, more of something else. So, there's some give and take throughout this whole process.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned like what they could do, because that was going to be my next question to you. If you had any advice for the student who is stuck in the situation where, hey, it's going to look different for me next year, and I don't want to have to leave school or come up with a plan B. So make sure that they're reaching out and talking, staying in touch with their financial aid staff there at their respective schools. So that's a great point. One thing I think I've noticed and I've gained from this conversation is that there are a lot of changes that are going to be taking place. We don't have all of the answers yet. The Department of Ed is still working on it, and they do have a plan to enroll all of the details for us soon, and we'll talk about that. From a Villanova standpoint, is there anything that you all are concerned about regarding the timeline and making sure you have all the tools to kind of like roll everything out, or are things starting to come into play for you to kind of say, okay, we can make it work yet?
When it first came out, we were like, oh, wow, especially not knowing when the FAFSA was going to come. But again, because we use the profile, again, this is Villanova speaking, that because we have that tool, we're going to be able to kind of have, I want to say business as usual, but with a twist, because we might not, and we're not going to be able to give an official Pell eligibility. There might be some more estimates for the new, the freshmen the students who might be admitted by early decision before the FAFSA is out. So we might have to go out with an estimate. And the nice thing is that the profile does give an estimated federal methodology, so we could maybe estimate something, but we can't give an official Pell eligibility, or officially that they're eligible for federal work study, or officially they're eligible for a subsidized loan, because we're not going to have an official, evaluation. So for schools that are similar to us, there's going to be a lot of, here's your award, and it's tentative, and probably nothing's going to say federal at this point. It's just going to create some extra work for us, because then we've got to go back in once the FAFSA data is complete. I think some schools similar to us are a little concerned about the timing, because especially for things like assets, they do ask asset questions on the FAFSA profile. Well, if a family's filling out a profile in October, and has X amount of assets, and then they're filling out the FAFSA in January, let's say, they have a different asset, there might be some additional clarification we may have to get. We're not as much worried about the income, because income is 2 years prior. So families have to remember that we went to a prior year evaluation of eligibility about 4 or 5 years ago, which we thought was going to be a major upheaval, but it's all worked. And so the information from your tax return, I mean, there's another, is going to be from 2022. Is that right?
Right. Yep, 2022.
So it's not going to be just from last year, and that's done. So, the income information, what is, that's not changing, but assets are more fluid. And so that's kind of an underlying question. Hopefully they're not going to change all that much between October and January in terms of your assets, but it's still something that schools have to work with. It's just going to mean for schools similar to us that we're going to have to do a little more going back, and we don't want to touch a file 2 or 3 times, but we're probably going to have to. And that may even be something, I don't know, for schools that are just using the FAFSA. There are some, maybe, some quick and dirty tools that a school might use to determine, again, an estimated federal, but nothing is going to be, confirmed until they file the FAFSA. And you've got to remember that for the family. Because some schools may also go out with, if they're on a rolling admission, they might go out with their merit aids, their merit process early in the fall, or, kind of late fall, maybe November, December. So they might go out with an award letter, an offer letter at that point. Again, it's not award, an offer letter at that point, and say, here's your eligibility for a merit scholarship. And the student thinking that's the only aid that they get, and not realizing that they still have to fill out the FAFSA, but at a later time. So I want to make sure, again, that the audience understands that, yeah, they may get something from the school, perhaps if they're going out with that merit offer, or maybe some sort of tentative notice based on maybe their institutional's own application of some sort. But in order to get federal aid, they have to complete the FAFSA. And so that we want to make sure, we don't want to make sure that there's a big decline in people filing the FAFSA because of this delay.
I totally agree with you on that. So some of the things we've gathered thus far, there are changes and they are coming. They're affecting everybody, from the students and the families to the schools, even those who, like I said, Thea, who are assisting students with completing FAFSAs or doing financial aid nights. There are counselors in the high schools and other areas who are assisting students, just trying to disseminate the information. So many different folks are going to be affected by the FAFSA changes. The goal, though, is to make it more simplified, possibly increase Pell eligibility for your low-income students. And again, it's supposed to decrease the number of questions. I think now we're at about 100 and 101 questions if someone had to answer every single thing. And I think it's going to drop it to under 40. I don't remember the exact number, but I know those questions, they're being sliced in half. So hopefully it is going to be a more simplified application for the families that are out there. Some things that will not change, though. We all know that every student who wants to be considered for aid from the federal government, from your institutions, from folks at FIA, like your state agencies, some scholarship organizations, students must complete the FAFSA application in order to be considered. They still have to list those schools on there that they're interested in attending in order for that information to be shared. They have to still make sure that they sign it, and all required parties on there have to provide their information. It still collects the gist of it's still the same. It's going to determine the financial strength by collecting basic income, asset information, basic family demographic information about the student's household as well. The manner in which it's shared, though, I think is really what's really been is one of the key differences. It's no longer the IRS data retrieval tool. Tax returns where you're able to have them done. Cost of attendance and how things are done with students. I think cost of attendance key changes Instead of saying room and board, we're saying meal and housing now, right? Is that
Food
it?
and
Is
housing,
meals and housing at home?
food and
Yep,
housing.
food and housing. Yep, are going to be the major changes there, but there are some things that are still staying the same. Couple things we want everyone to take away and to remember is that resources are available on every level. So the Department of Ed has launched what they call Better FAFSA, Better Future Roadmap that is out there. For the institutions, state agencies, counselors, folks like that, there's a financial aid toolkit with the Department of Ed's financial aid toolkit.ed.gov, and it's going to have a variety of different things that are kicking off as early as summer, really like 2 weeks from now. I think we're in summer almost, but everything from videos, financial aid estimator previews, tools, trainings, fact sheets, all of that stuff to kind of help us be fully prepared, to help the schools be pretty prepared and comfortable testing some things out. I think from a student and family resource, we also have things for them as well. And that, I believe, Bonnie, that's all going to be at studentaid.gov, right? I think that was the main source from the federal government. Everything's going to be at studentaid.gov. And they're going to launch things from the summer through the fall of 2023, really doing what they can to get all students and families ready and prepared for the new FAFSA form, for the new FAFSA process. It's going to give you new terminology to work with. And there'll be some videos. There'll be information on how to complete the FSA IDs, the Federal Student Aid ID accounts for the student. And also, you don't need a social security number. That's something new as well. I think they were saying you don't need a social security number now in order to have a Federal Student Aid ID account. So if there's a parent or someone on there who didn't have a social security number, there's another way that they can still get an FSA ID account that is out there. The Better FAFSA, Better Future Roadmap, again, is through the Department of Education, Federal Department of Education, but also for students and families and anyone involved. Your post-secondary schools that you're interested in attending, make sure you're staying in touch with them. Make sure you're checking their websites, because as their processes are changing or their deadlines and dates are changing, you want to make sure that you're not missing out on anything. From a FIA standpoint, make sure that you're tapping into us. We'll still be doing our financial aid nights, our FAFSA completion workshops, and some other things as well. We'll still be updating you with the podcast. Bonnie, if I've missed anything, did I miss anything on some additional resources that are out there? It's kind of
no, I mean, I'm just looking at kind of the federal roadmap, but for students and families, starting the summer, they're going to be doing some outreach campaigns and probably public service announcements and things like that. So you might hear, in the past, maybe you didn't hear as much about it, but kind of keep your ears and your eyes and ears open, because if there's ever a year you need to stay tuned, this is the year that's going to be really critical.
Anything else that you wanted to add on that we've not talked about regarding FAFSA or anything in general in financial aid?
You can't see my desk, and if you did, there's like 25 different pieces of paper. There's so many different levels to this. I mean, we went through a lot, things that have been added, things that have been subtracted from the FAFSA. And, I don't know where this podcast is going to be reaching, but another change that a family might see is the new methodology isn't looking at business. It is looking at business and farm information, where in the past it didn't. Now that I'm in the Philadelphia area, so there's not many farms around here, but for our constituents in, the middle of the state, or if you live in the Midwest, you didn't have to report values of farm for asset information. That's coming back on, unless there's a change. There's a bill that's being talked about. I think it's being presented, but that hasn't been approved at this point. So you really need to read the form. There's also another change that again seems nuanced, but the FAFSA is going to be asking for race and ethnicity questions. I want the audience, especially the families and students, to understand that is not considered at all in the determination of or eligibility of aid. Apparently, it's just going to be used, from what we've been told, for statistical research, I guess, to see how many students, of different races and ethnicities are filing. If they don't want to file it, or if they don't want to complete that, our understanding is they don't need to. But that could be a put off to some students, and we don't want them to say, well, why are they asking this? That's strictly for, kind of research at this point. And I'm sure that'll be told on there, but it's something that somebody may say, wait a minute, that's a change that hasn't been put in there. The question about the number of family members in college, I mentioned that that's no longer in the formula, but it's going to be on the FAFSA. So, some things that we think probably should have been taken off, because if you're not going to include a discount for multiple family members in college at the same time, why are you putting it on? Well, it's being asked, and for schools that might be something that we can use to maybe adjust the institutional aid. But again, that's not going to be included in the federal methodology. So you just got to go through the process, go with it as it is. Sometimes it's going to be asked for statistical reasons. Sometimes the questions are going to be asked for, formulaic evaluation of the family. So it's a lot of things, not only for the families and students to absorb, but counselors, financial aid administrators, people at organizations that help families and students file. God bless them, because this is a big change to them, especially, for a lot of our lower income families who are going to see, probably the biggest change of these. So, God bless them, because it's a year of change. The big thing is the year this year. Once we get this through, it'll work out, and it'll just become kind of a normal process in how we evaluate. But change is difficult for everybody, and this is the one time we are all going through it. There's not anybody in this whole kind of higher educational spectrum, or kind of that's not going through this change. We're all going through this together. And reach out, like you said, there's FIA has resources and can answer questions. The school, federal government has. So this is not the year to sit back and say, I just don't, I want to give up. If education is your goal, we want to make sure that, and if financing is a big issue, or seen as an obstacle, we don't want that to be an obstacle. There's lots of us who are out there that can help you through this process.
Absolutely. So we're all in this together. And like you said, reach out, stay informed, make sure that as things are changing, that, we understand them. If you don't understand them, find someone a professional who can assist you, federal level, state level, even with the schools as well. Like you said, we're all in it together, and I'm certain we'll get through it successfully. And then again, when we're talking the 25-26 academic school year, we'll have a year under our belt, and things will go back. FAFSA will go back to opening October 1st that following year. So again, we just have to get through this year with the new change, and I'm pretty sure we'll get through it. We've been through all of the other changes. We'll get through this one as well. Bonnie, again, I thank you for joining me today. Thank you for sharing all of the information that you have regarding FAFSA simplification, or just the whole financial aid and information in general. You are a wealth of knowledge that is out there. And again, thank you for joining the Higher Education Access Partner. Thank all of our listeners for tuning in. Stay tuned, and I would love to have Bonnie back if she wants to come at a later date sometime this year, because I know there's more to unfold. Thanks again, Bonnie.
Good luck to everybody involved in this process.